At 4 a.m. on March 30, 1867, two men sat across from each other in a smoke-filled room in Washington, D.C. The candles had burned down to stumps. The ashtrays overflowed with cigar butts. Outside, the Capitol streets were empty and silent. But inside the State Department, William Seward, the Secretary of State of the United States, was sweating despite the spring chill. He had been negotiating all night. He had just offered $6.5 million for a piece of territory larger than Texas and California combined. The Russian diplomat sitting across from him, Eduard de Stockel, said nothing. He simply stared at the American, his face unreadable in the flickering candlelight. The silence was unbearable. Seward broke. He raised his own offer against himself. $7 million, he blurted. $7 million. Final offer? Stockel paused, then he nodded. $7 million plus $200,000 to cover the transaction fees. Done. In that moment, before the sun rose over the Potomac, Russia sold 586,412 square miles of North American territory for $7.2 million. Less than 2 cents per acre. The largest land sale in human history was finalized in the dark. The newspapers would call it Seward's Folly. They would mock him for buying a frozen wasteland. But the real story wasn't about what America bought. It was about what Russia was desperate to sell. Because 3 years earlier, the Russian Empire had bled itself nearly to death. The treasury was empty. The currency was collapsing. And the most powerful autocracy in Europe was one bad harvest away from bankruptcy. The sale of Alaska wasn't a real estate transaction. It was a financial rescue operation. It was the liquidation of an asset by a government that had run out of options. This is the story of how financial desperation became geopolitical genius, how a bankrupt empire turned its weakness into strategy, and how the hand that sold the territory was actually holding the winning card all along. To understand why Russia sold Alaska for pennies, you have to go back to the winter of 1856. Russia had just lost the Crimean War, not just lost it, been humiliated by it. For 3 years, Russia had fought Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. The Russian army, massive but technologically backward, was slaughtered. Russian soldiers froze in the trenches outside Sevastopol. They died of cholera and typhus faster than they died from bullets. The British and French navies controlled the Black Sea. They bombarded Russian coastal cities at will. Russian supply lines collapsed. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed on March 30, 1856, exactly 11 years to the day before Alaska would be sold, the Russian Empire was broken. But the military defeat was just the visible wound. The financial hemorrhage was worse. The Crimean War cost Russia 800 million rubles. The annual state budget was 220 million rubles. That means this single war consumed nearly 4 years of the entire national budget. Russia didn't have that money, so the government printed it. They issued credit notes. They flooded the market with paper rubles, and predictably the currency collapsed. By 1855, the ruble was trading at 94% of face value. The budget deficit reached 772 million rubles. That's 3.5 times the annual budget. Foreign investors saw the numbers and fled. The Russian bond market crashed. The state's credit rating evaporated. When the war ended, the bleeding didn't stop. It just slowed down. The government faced 3 simultaneous crises. First, they had to stabilize the currency. But you can't restore a currency's value when your treasury is empty. Second, they had massive debts to repay. Interest payments were accumulating. Creditors were circling. Third, they had to rebuild the military. Russia had just been defeated by technologically superior enemies. If they didn't modernize, they would lose their status as a great power. They had to spend on all 3 fronts at once. But there was no money. This is where the Russian government discovered something that would become a recurring nightmare for empires throughout history. When you're bankrupt, every solution creates a new problem. Every attempt to fix the crisis makes the crisis worse. Think about the geometry of their trap. If they raised taxes, they would crush the peasantry and risk rebellion. If they cut spending, they would weaken the military and invite invasion. If they printed more money, they would destroy what little remained of the ruble's value. If they borrowed from foreign banks, they would surrender their sovereignty to European creditors. There was no good option, only different flavors of disaster. Here's how the Russian financial system actually worked in the 1850s and why it was structurally doomed. The government's revenue came from 5 main sources: poll taxes on peasants, Obrok payments from state-owned serfs, taxes on industry, liquor taxes, stamp duties, but here's the catch. Most peasants weren't free, they were serfs owned by the nobility. The nobles controlled how much of the peasants' output went to the state versus into the nobles' private pocket, and the nobles were already drowning in debt. Over 60% of all serfs had been pledged as collateral to state credit institutions. The noble class was the government's primary creditor. They had mortgaged their estates to survive, so when the government needed more tax revenue after the Crimean War, they couldn't just squeeze the peasants harder. The peasants had nothing left to give, and the nobles who controlled them were too indebted to cooperate. The government tried a different strategy. In January 1857, they authorized massive railroad construction. 4,000 kilometers of new track. The theory was elegant. Railroads would modernize the economy. They would increase productivity. They would attract foreign investment. Eventually, they would generate new tax revenue. But building railroads costs money up front, and Russia didn't have it, so they tried a financial trick. They lowered the interest rates they paid on deposits at state credit institutions. They cut rates from 5% to 4%. The plan was to push capital out of the state banks and into the new private railroad companies. If it worked, the state would save 11 to 12 million rubles per year in interest payments. It backfired spectacularly. Imagine you are a wealthy merchant in St. Petersburg in July 1857. You have your life savings deposited in a state bank. You've been earning 5% interest. Suddenly, the government announces they're cutting the rate to 4%. What do you think? You think the government is in trouble. You think they're trying to save money because they're going bankrupt. The newspapers have been writing about Russia's debt burden. Foreign investors are pulling out. So when the state cuts interest rates, you interpret it as a signal. Get your money out now before it's too late. That's exactly what happened. Depositors panicked. They withdrew their money in waves. By 1858, withdrawals exceeded new deposits by 50 million rubles. The state credit institutions started to collapse. The banks that were supposed to support the Russian economy were now on the verge of failure. By 1859, Russia had a debt crisis, a currency crisis, and a banking crisis all at the same time. The empire was hemorrhaging from multiple wounds. While the Russian treasury was collapsing, a nightmare scenario was unfolding in the Pacific. Britain was building up its naval presence. During the Crimean War, British and French ships had roamed the Russian Far East, attacking settlements and fortifications. The message was clear: the Royal Navy controlled the ocean. Britain held Canada. Britain was expanding into Australia. Britain was the world's supreme maritime power, and Russia owned Alaska. Alaska was a territory of 586,412 square miles, rich in furs, potentially rich in resources, but it was 4,000 miles from St. Petersburg. It took months to send supplies around the world. If war broke out between Russia and Britain, the British Navy could cut off Alaska's supply lines in weeks. The Russian-American company, the state monopoly that ran the fur trade, would collapse. Worse, the British could simply take Alaska by force. They could land troops in Sitka. They could occupy the territory, and Russia couldn't stop them. The Russian Navy was weaker than the British Navy. The distance was too great. The logistics were impossible. There had been a neutrality agreement during the Crimean War. The Russian-American Company and the British Hudson's Bay Company had agreed not to attack each other, but that agreement was temporary. Everyone knew the next war between Russia and Britain could start at any moment. Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, the younger brother of Tsar Alexander II and commander of the Russian Navy, looked at the map and saw the trap. If Britain seized Alaska in the next war, Russia would get nothing. Zero. The territory would be gone, the investment would be lost, the humiliation would be total. But what if Russia sold Alaska voluntarily? What if they sold it now while they still could, while there was still a buyer willing to pay? Russia would get cash. Immediately. Cash they desperately needed to stabilize their collapsing financial system. And there was a strategic bonus. If Russia sold Alaska to the United States, they would block British expansion. The United States and Britain were not friends. The American Civil War had just ended. Britain had nearly intervened on behalf of the Confederacy. American-British relations were tense. By putting the United States in control of Alaska, Russia would create a buffer between itself and Britain. They would turn a liability into a geopolitical weapon. In 1857, Konstantin wrote to the Tsar. He said Russia should take advantage of the excess money in the United States Treasury and sell them Alaska. He framed it as opportunity, but the underlying logic was desperation. The Tsar didn't commit immediately. He waited. 11 years would pass, the American Civil War would intervene, but the financial pressure never stopped. By 1867, Russia's situation had gotten worse. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 had created a new fiscal nightmare. The state had to compensate nobles for losing their human property. The costs were enormous, the treasury was still empty. Russia needed money fast. When Edouard de Stockel opened negotiations with William Seward in early 1867, he knew he held a weak hand. Russia was desperate. Alaska was indefensible. The fur trade was dying. The Russian-American company was barely profitable. Stockel's job was to get as much money as possible for a territory everyone knew Russia couldn't keep. Seward, on the other hand, was an expansionist. He believed in manifest destiny. He wanted to grow American territory. He had been thinking about Alaska for years. During the Civil War, when Russia had provided diplomatic support to the Union, Seward had started planning. This was his moment. The negotiation was remarkably brief. Seward opened by offering $5 million. Stockel said nothing. He didn't counter. He just stayed silent. The silence made Seward nervous. Maybe the deal would fall apart. Maybe the Russians would walk away. Seward, anxious, raised his own offer. He went to $5.5 million. Still Stockel said nothing. Seward went to $6 million, then $6.5 million. Finally, Stockel spoke. He asked for $7 million. Seward agreed instantly. But Stockel made one more request. He wanted the payment drawn on a Washington bank, not a London bank. The London bankers would charge fees. Seward agreed to add $200,000 to cover this. Final price $7.2 million. The treaty was signed at 4 a.m. on March 30, 1867, after an all-night negotiating session. Stockel received a $25,000 bonus from the Tsar for his diplomatic success, plus an annual pension of $6,000 for life. The Russian government received $7.2 million in gold, roughly 7 million rubles at the exchange rate of the time. It was a fraction of the state's debt. It barely made a dent in the deficit, but it was cash, liquid, immediate, and in 1867 liquidity was survival. The newspapers in America mocked the purchase. They called it Seward's Folly. They called Alaska a frozen wasteland. An icebox, a polar bear garden, but the newspapers didn't understand what Seward understood and what Stockel understood even better. This wasn't a real estate deal. It was a geopolitical transaction. Russia wasn't selling Alaska because they suddenly realized the territory was worthless. Russia was selling Alaska because they understood something more important than land. They understood solvency. They understood survival. $7 million wasn't a fortune, but it was better than zero. And zero was what Russia would get if they held onto Alaska and lost it to Britain in the next war. The Alaska Purchase set off a chain reaction that would reshape the North Pacific for the next century and a half. 30 years after the sale, in 1898, the Klondike Gold Rush began. Prospectors flooded into Alaska and the Yukon. They pulled millions of dollars in gold out of the ground, more than the entire purchase price in just a few years. Later, oil was discovered, massive deposits. Alaska became one of America's primary petroleum producers. Today, the state's economic value is measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. From a pure financial perspective, Russia sold $1 trillion asset for the price of a large mansion, but that analysis misses the point entirely. From Russia's perspective in 1867, selling Alaska was rational, coldly, mathematically rational. First, Russia couldn't defend Alaska. If Britain seized it, Russia would get nothing. Second, Russia couldn't develop Alaska. The resources were too far away, the settlement was too sparse. The Russian-American company was dying. The fur trade had been overharvested. Returns were minimal. Third, Russia needed cash immediately. The financial crisis was acute. The banking system was collapsing. The government needed liquidity to avoid total meltdown. $7 million wasn't compensation for Alaska's total resource potential. It was the price of keeping the Russian state solvent for another year. But there's a deeper genius to the deal that most historians miss. Russia didn't just sell Alaska for money. Russia sold Alaska to hurt Britain. This was the poison pill strategy. By transferring Alaska to the United States, Russia ensured that Britain's rival would control the territory. Britain couldn't use Alaska as a base. Britain couldn't expand through Alaska into Russian Siberia. The United States was now wedged between Russia and Britain in the Pacific, and Russia sent a signal to Washington: "We are willing to cooperate with you. We sold you a massive territory at a fair price. We are your potential friend against British expansion." The geopolitical architecture created by the Alaska sale lasted for 150 years. During the Cold War, Alaska became America's forward base for monitoring Soviet movements. It became a critical piece of American military infrastructure. The sale that seemed like Russian weakness in 1867 looked like Russian foresight by 1947, but there's one more consequence, one that echoes today. The Alaska sale represented a fundamental shift in Russian strategy. Russia was withdrawing from Western expansion and focusing on Asia, on Siberia, on the Far East, on the Pacific. This strategic pivot defined Russian imperial policy for the next 50 years. It led directly to Russian expansion into Manchuria, into conflict with Japan, into the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, where Russia's overreach resulted in catastrophic defeat. Russia traded one frontier for another. They sold Alaska to fund expansion elsewhere, and that elsewhere would eventually bleed them just as badly as the Crimean War. So why did Russia really sell Alaska? The simple answer is bankruptcy. The Crimean War destroyed the state finances. The banking system collapsed. The government couldn't raise revenue. It faced a choice: default on obligations or sell an asset it couldn't defend. But the deeper answer reveals something about power that most nations refuse to admit until it's too late. Financial weakness is military weakness. If your treasury is empty, your navy is irrelevant. If your navy is irrelevant, you can't defend distant colonies. And if you can't defend them, they're not assets. They're liabilities waiting to be seized by someone stronger. Russia could have tried to hold Alaska, but doing so would have required massive military spending to defend against British encroachment. That would have worsened the financial crisis. Eventually, Russia would have gone bankrupt anyway and lost Alaska with nothing. By selling Alaska, Russia chose the path of strategic dignity. They got paid. They maintained geopolitical influence. They created a potential ally. They preserved state solvency. The deal was a triumph of statecraft in a moment of weakness. Today, when we see nations selling strategic assets, granting concessions to foreign powers, or liquidating territory, we call it defeat. We call it surrender. We call it the end of empire. But sometimes the nation that sells its future is actually buying time. Sometimes the hand that offers the territory is the hand that's playing the longer game. The Alaska Purchase teaches us that sovereignty is not about flags and borders. Sovereignty is about solvency. If you cannot pay your debts, you cannot defend your land, and if you cannot defend your land, you do not own it. You're just holding it until someone stronger decides to take it. Russia understood this in 1867. They sold Alaska not because they were weak, but because they understood that pretending to be strong when you're bankrupt is the fastest way to lose everything. The territory they sold became American. The gold they received kept the Russian state alive, and the geopolitical buffer they created kept Britain at bay for another century. That's not folly, that's survival.